This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Colin Beavan is a man of impact, or no impact. Author, transformational coach, and instigator of thought and action, Colin lived in New York City for a year with a net zero impact on the environment. He joins me on this episode to discuss his mission in life to drive people to take action for what they believe in, even if at first it doesn't seem important. He shows us that we should become Lifequesters and drive ourselves towards personal change before we can try to change others. He challenged me to break through the limiting beliefs and standard life approach that society has defined for us. We also explain the importance of servant leadership, the pressure fame puts on your voice and your podium, and how Zen philosophy can help us to understand that we may not be able to change the world, but we can certainly try. Colin is the author of How to Be Alive, No Impact Man, and one of the best historical accounts of Operation Jedburgh, which his grandfather was a part of in World War II. Colin has been named one of MSN's 10 most influential men and one of Elle Magazine's Eco-Illuminators. He speaks and consults around the world to businesses, universities, nonprofits, and community groups. Colin, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Thanks, Fran. It's nice to be here.
I am excited about this episode because it brings together some core elements of the Jedburgh podcast itself and so much about being a leader in today's world. I started this podcast because my vision was to tell a story, to talk about transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge, which meant that the guests, they actually had to do something. They couldn't just talk about it. They had to not only dream big, but they had to take steps to execute their vision. And then also at times get knocked down along the way, learn from it, get back up and keep going. And so you and I, we spoke a few weeks ago in preparation for this, and I spoke to you a little bit about why I called this the Jedburgh podcast. And it was a bit because of my personal history as a Green Beret in the U.S. Army Special Forces, and then telling this lineage back to the first special operators in the Jedburgh teams of World War II, which you wrote a book on. But during that writing, you had realizations about the military, the drivers behind global conflicts, the effect that people were having on the environment primarily. And then this led you to the No Impact Project, and you became No Impact Man, and is almost with this superhero allure behind it. And there was a book, a documentary. Your family lived with a net zero impact on the environment for a year in New York City. And you drove change through your own personal doing and showing that you can change the world with small changes of yourself and those around you that can have lasting impact. And then that led to what you call your greatest work, the book, How to Be Alive, a guide to the kind of happiness that helps the world. And this is a how-to book. How do you look internal to find yourself, a will to drive change, and take the small incremental steps to live a better life for yourself and those around you? So I'm drawn to you. I know that was a lot, but you're a doer. You're not a sayer. You see a challenge and you begin to execute. And that to me defines a transformative leader. And I'm ready to talk about all these things.
Great. What a great summary. Thanks, Fran.
So I feel like we could start in a lot of different places, and I named a whole bunch of them. And the natural tendency would certainly be to start with a discussion of one of the books. But I don't think that the books are the foundation of you. I think the books are the medium. They're the venue through which you inform, you educate, and you advocate for what defines you. And when I think about you, I think, and your work, I'm brought to two concepts, and they come up in a lot of conversations here on the podcast and in my work, and that's vision and mission, and the difference between the two. Vision is defined as a thought, a concept, an object formed by the imagination, a manifestation of the senses of something immaterial, the act or power of an imagination. And mission is defined as a specific task which a person or a group is charged, a pre-established and often self-imposed objective or purpose. Many people have ideas. They have visions. I call a vision a requirement for a leader in any organization because you have to know where you're going to take the organization. And then organizations likewise have to have missions. In fact, it's one of the critical pieces of designing sustainable and resilient organizations. It's the why we are here. And that is often more important than what we do, because if you don't know why you're doing something, then it doesn't matter what you're doing. You have a documented mission, and I'm going to read it. And it's, quote, to purposely engage individuals, businesses, politicians, educators, and religious leaders in the quest for human and value-centered adaptations to lifestyles and organizational and societal systems that make people happier and the whole world safer. So by definition, mission is an action. I'm interested in your thoughts on mission versus vision and how defining your mission has allowed you to take a stand when the easier path would be to sit back and talk about it.
First of all, Fran, mission is, for me, something, do you know when you fly, and this you're going to be like, what's he talking about? But bear with me. You know when you're coming in for a landing?
I get that a lot, so it's okay.
Yeah. When you're coming in for a landing in New York City, where I live in Brooklyn in New York, and you're coming in for a landing, most times you come in over the ocean, so you look down and you can see boats. And when you look down at the boats, you can see their wake behind them. And because they're just dots at that stage, you're so high up, they're just dots. You can't really see what direction they're going in. The only way you can tell what direction they're going in is by seeing what direction they've come from through their wake. So for myself, my mission has been defined pretty much by looking at my wake. What am I drawn to? What have I in all these years been drawn to? What do I do? As opposed to, say, coming up with this idea, I'm going to accomplish this. I more or less ask the question, like, what is it that I have chosen to accomplish? And how has that iterated and become more and more specific? And then when I see that, then how do I want to iterate it forward? So the big question for me is, who am I? Like, what am I? What's my job here? So my mission is largely about helping people see that a lot of what we chase after at human beings doesn't make us happy, and that there are things that can make us happy, and that largely what makes us happy is to be ourselves in service of others, assuming that we have food, assuming we have shelter, and all of that. So when that mission that you read, that mission that you read, which talks about organizations and religious leaders and societies and whatnot, the big question for me is, how can we align our lives? How can we align the operation of our organizations and our societies and our religious institutions? How can we actually align those things with true human purpose? That's my mission, ultimately. How do we align things with human purpose? Now, vision, I think of, is just the way that I choose. When I vision something, I vision a way that I choose to fulfill my mission. So I hope that answers your question on the difference between vision and mission for me.
No, it does. And I like this analogy you used about the wake and looking in the past and understanding where you came from to start to dictate how you're going to move forward. And in your book, How to Be Alive, you introduced two concepts. One was the concept of Lifequester, which you defined as people who define and live according to new facts of life. But then you spoke about standard life approach. And I believe that this concept is the foundation of what drives personal and societal change, because it starts with understanding ourselves and where we come from and how do we react and how do we interpret the world around us. And so the first step of becoming a transformative leader means that we must transform ourselves first by looking internal. And so there are 4 tenets to being a life quester, and you've identified them as someone who tries to understand their true nature and uses that understanding to make a better life for herself and others. A person who attempts to live his own values rather than what society dictates and is excited by what he might discover. Third, someone who has faith that letting go of limiting stories about herself and the world will allow something wonderful to open up. And fourth, just being a fun, wicked, cool person, which I like the word wicked because I'm from Boston. And so, we always, that's like the coined phrase there. It was wicked cool. And you're a wicked cool person. So I'm interested a little bit more on defining what a life quester is and why it's the first step to change. And then also, what is the standard life approach and why do we need to challenge that?
So at the beginning of that, we talked about, the first definition that I put to the word life quester is somebody who understands themselves, right? somebody who comes to understand themselves and then uses that to help the world. So that, by the way, takes us back to that whole wake idea, that there's this element of, I think we're taught so much about coming up with ideas of who we should be, right? As opposed to actually examining our own natures and asking ourselves, who are we? What are we? I was joking with somebody the other day. We were making some plans and they said, they're not a good planner. I said something like, yeah, and me either. And then they said something like, but you seem to have such confidence about it. And I said, it's not that I have confidence about it. It's just that I understand that just as I have to accept certain things about the world has to accept certain things about me. So my point is here, like, what does it mean to be human? That's the first thing, right? So that sounds like off topic, but it's very much on topic because we have what I've called the standard life approach. And the standard life approach is something that maybe used to work, at least for a certain segment of the population. The standard life approach goes like this. You go to school, you get good grades, right? You get yourself into a good college. You take out whatever student loans are necessary to get into that college because you'll be able to pay them back because you're going to be making so much money later that you will be able to pay them back, right?
I'm still paying for undergrad, by the way. So I graduated almost 20 years ago.
Exactly. Okay. So this is why it's a little bit of a myth, right? Then you get the best job you can, paying the most amount you can. Hopefully you get to be expressive and creative in some ways, in the ways that are important to you. But most of all, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to make enough monies to support your family, to buy your home. That's part of the standard life approach too, to buy a home, which will go up in value. That's actually how you're supposed to build your wealth for the average person. Meanwhile, you don't have to worry too much about whether you're helpful to the world, because when you pay taxes, that goes towards social services and fire trucks and all of that and everything we need in society. So just by doing your job and paying taxes, you're helping the world. Meanwhile, you buy stuff and that keeps people employed and keeps the factories running. And you kind of keep along that way until you get your kids educated. And then hopefully you retire and you have a lovely retirement. And that's the standard life approach, right? And to some extent, in a certain part of our history, it worked. But for the last, say, 20 years, that hasn't worked. Oh, and we should say, by the way, it never worked for a big segment of the population. But over the last 20 years, that myth has broken down. Like you just said, you're still paying your undergrad student loans back 20 years later. So lots of people who are in debt for college, that dream of college actually paying for itself because we get such a good job doesn't come true. That dream that our houses were necessarily like rocket ship up in value doesn't necessarily come true. That idea that by paying our taxes and buying things, that will turn the wheels of the economy and therefore we'll be productive, just helpful members, good worker bees, good worker ants. So many of us are waking up to the fact that the standard way that our society operates isn't dignified, isn't equitable for people, and it also destroys the habitat that we depend upon for our health and our happiness and our security. So there's a way in which this mythology of living the great American dream, if you like, the standard life approach, is breaking down. The thing about it is that it's not so easy to break away from that, to just think about what one has to deal with with one's parents if one decides to become an artist, let's say. And what the way that our parents will worry about, will you make a living? So breaking away from that is hard. And there isn't a new path forward laid down for young people. There isn't a new way of being. So what I call people that break away from that standard life approach, what I call is Lifequesters. People that are questing after a life, a high quality life, a life of contentment, a life of happiness, a life where they get to feel as though they're useful and not harmful to others, right? And there is as yet no new standard way to move forward that fulfill those things. Each person who chooses to divert from the standard approach to life is in a way a bushwhacker, going out and trying new things and creating a path for other people to follow.
And creating their own path.
That's right. In creating their own path. That's one of the cool things about being a life quester. In creating our own, each time one of us has the courage to actually ask ourselves, who am I, right? What am I? And how does that connect to this suffering world in which I operate, right? How do my particular gifts and talents connect to the needs of this world, right? Each time one of us actually asks that question sincerely, as opposed to just following the standard life approach, right? We ask that question sincerely. What am I as a person? What is this world? And what does it need from me sincerely? And we lay down our own path. It actually gives permission to others to follow in a similar path.
And they're building that community that you've talked about. And by building that community, then you create traction in these initiatives.
Sure. One thing that happens is that when we live by a certain set of values, we attract other people that share those values. And we come to, in all things, all the work on group shows this. If you hang around with drug addicts and alcoholics, chances are you're going to end up being a drug addict and alcoholic. If you hang around with sincere, value-based people who are moving forward in ways that help themselves and help the world, chances are you are too. So yeah, community forms. And in community, that's a case where actually the rising tide does float all boats, unlike the economy. But in community, when one of us moves up, we pull other people up with us.
Mm-hmm. And so you introduced Lifequester concept in the most recent book, but I would argue, and you'll probably agree, that you really defined Lifequester and were a Lifequester as the no impact man. And this was a project in which you and your family, so you had that community around you, aimed to live with zero carbon, zero waste in the ground, zero pollution in the air, zero resources sucked from the earth, zero toxins in the water, no environmental impact. And you did this for a year. Can you describe the No Impact Project and what I called your ascension to the no impact man?
So I think it's just because you were talking about the standard ways of life and life questers and stuff like that, I think it's important maybe and you mentioned Operation Jedburgh, my previous work. I think it might be good to introduce the concept of no impact man by also talking about the life path that led to me being no impact man. Here's what happened.
The boat wake.
The boat wake.
The boat wake. How did we get here?
That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? So I wanted all my life to be a writer, but I didn't know anybody who was a writer. I didn't know how you made a living as a writer and all of that. So actually, I studied electrical engineering. I got a PhD in it, and it made me miserable. I was very good at it, but it made me miserable. And then I had the opportunity to move into public relations for a bunch of reasons, because I've been writing as a hobby. And public relations, again, at least I was moving towards being a writer. And I was using my skills as a writer, right? This is important because what we're talking about is understanding who we are and moving towards the truth of who we are. So I moved into public relations. I worked for only nonprofits and organizations with a social good. And then finally, at the age of around 30, I had the courage to finally just decide I'm going to be a writer, not a PR person, which for me was a halfway thing. I'm going to try and be a writer. I wrote 2 history books. One's called Fingerprints and is about the origins of forensic science. And then Operation Jedburgh, which is about guys who jumped in to occupy France to arm and mobilize the French resistance against the Germans, as you mentioned. And in some ways, I kind of was at the top of my game. I was in my young 30s. I'd written 2 books that were well received critically, and I was doing fine.
On a topic that really very few people have written about, I do want to add that there are very few people who met the folks that you did and have been able to tell that story with the clarity and the detail that you did.
Right. Which, by the way, made it, to use the word wicked hard book to write. Because retelling a tale that somebody else has told before, that's not a hard book to write. This was a tale that hadn't really been told before. That's right. When I was researching that book, Fran, I'm not a soldier. I've never been to war. But I talked to around 80 veterans of World War II. And these were not just frontline veterans. These were men, old men, who, when they were young, had been running around behind the lines where the rules of war didn't apply. And they had seen and experienced horrors, I think, beyond what an everyday soldier sees and experiences, which in itself can be a horror, right? And it really sensitized me to what wars do to people. I mean, that probably sounds like a cliche, but in my body. And then right around that time, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars started. And shortly after that was the story of Abu Ghraib came out. If you remember, Abu Ghraib was a big thing in the press. It was about how American soldiers had tortured Iraqi prisoners. And whilst everybody else was outraged because the American soldiers had tortured those prisoners, what I was outraged at was the surprise. I was outraged that people thought that we went to war and acted like perfect gentlemen and gentlewomen when our own comrades were getting shot at and killed, right? That people were so naive about war that they didn't understand it, and that they would take our country into a war for oil, right, without really understanding what we were subjecting our men and young women to. Not to mention the Iraqi and Afghanistan citizens too. So I was just like, and that sensitivity came from having talked to those 80 veterans. So what happened was I was like, I just can't, there I was. I actually kind of arrived in New York as a writer. I'd written 2 books. I was doing great. But I was like, it's not enough. It's not enough just to be successful. It felt somehow empty. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted to do something about the fact that we were destroying ourselves and our habitat for oil and fossil fuels. And how could we change? And the fact that we were destroying ourselves and our world for these fossil fuels without necessarily having a party, meaning we were doing what we had to do to keep fueling this standard way of life. But meanwhile, the standard way of life wasn't working for people. It wasn't making the middle-class kids who went to college and got the student loan to do it. Wasn't working for them. And it certainly wasn't working for the people who were less well off than them. And so I was like, what do I do? I can't go on just writing history books that people enjoy reading. What do I do? That's when I came up with this idea of No Impact Man. At first, I thought I was going to write a book about how all you people should stop driving SUVs and using air conditioners.
The sayer. You would have been the sayer at that point.
That's right. I was going to be the finger wagger. Mm-hmm. Then one day, Fran, I still remember to this day, it was a hot August day, and the hallway of the apartment building I lived was not ventilated, and it was sweltering. And I went into my apartment. I opened the door to the apartment. No one was home. And the apartment was frigid cold because I had left the air conditioners all day long. Because as you know, waiting 10 minutes for our home to cool down when we get home is just too much. So we have
it's inconvenient.
It's so inconvenient. But because of what had been on my mind when I stepped in and I thought, wow, I left the air conditioners on all day long today. I wasted fossil fuels all day long because I didn't want to wait 10 minutes for the apartment to cool down. And then, because it was on my mind, I thought, what does it take to get these fossil fuels? And just at the moment, it takes a lot of young men and women shooting and being shot at and dying and experience intense cruelty and perpetrating intense cruelty, which I say because, people carry the scars of what they've done as well as what has been done to them. And I thought, if young men and women are dying for energy, and I'm the type of person that leaves my air conditioners on all day long with no one home, like that energy, if I'm wasting that energy, what does that say about me and those young men and women? Me and those soldiers that are literally losing their lives so I could run my air conditioner, right? And at that point, I realized I don't want to write a book about how all you people should change. I thought maybe I should just write a book about me changing. And I came up with this concept called No Impact Man. And the idea was that me and my family, it was then comprised, my then wife, Michelle, my daughter, Isabella, my dog, Frankie. We would live together in New York City, creating as little environmental impact as possible. And when I say that, I don't mean that we recycled better. What I mean is that if it created something that needed to be recycled, we didn't do it. So we bought nothing new. We bought nothing in packaging. We didn't use our air conditioners. We didn't go anywhere if it meant that we would have to use fossil fuels to get there. So we only biked and walked for a year. We only ate food that was grown within 100 miles because of the environmental impact of food transportation. et cetera, et cetera. And it was an experiment, Fran, and I went into it thinking more or less like a penitent, like I was serving penance for being a rich consumerist American, and I was going to martyr myself on the cross of the environment sort of thing. But what it turned into was it turned into a year-long quest and musing into the question of what is actually important in life. When my sister got married, she had an oven in her kitchen in the house that she and her fiance had. She had a microwave. She had a toaster oven. But when she got married, somebody gave her a chicken oven. A chicken oven is an individual oven, and it's used the only thing you can cook in it is a whole chicken. It sits on the countertop, and it will cook a whole chicken for you.
I've never heard or seen a chicken oven.
Look it up. Google. But my point is that we've gotten to the point where you already have an oven, you already have a toaster oven, you already have a microwave. We're like, okay, now I need, right? Not to say my sister needed it. It was a wedding gift. But there's something about that, my sense was that we had moved kind of into the obscene, where this standard life approach, right? It was actually taking us places that really didn't make us happy. So No Impact Man, it was about living as environmentally as possible, but it was also about questioning this consumerist society that we live in and asking whether this constant resource extraction, mold it into a product, bury it, and then buy the same thing over again economy that we worked in, does it really make people happy, or is there something better for us?
And taking the first step is hard. And you mentioned it. You said that, you first put this concept together. You were going to be the person who stood up and told everyone. And I want to read a quote from the project because I think it really sums up the moment that you or even a leader or a person sits there and says, I've had enough, right? And I don't think enough people are able to stop for a moment and internalize that. And so I want to put this out there. And your quote is, I had occasionally tried to make a difference in the world, but I was coming to think my political views had too often been about changing other people and too seldom about changing myself. I made the mistake of thinking that condemning other people's misdeeds somehow made me virtuous. My problem was my inaction. I was worried sick about something and doing nothing about it. I wasn't sick of the world. I was sick of myself. I was sick of my comfortable and easy pretension of helplessness. If I was still a student, I'd have marched against myself. Which I did laugh out loud when I read that one because I really liked that. But I feel like that really sums up this moment. And then in How to Be Alive, as we kind of blend, a little bit of these concepts, you bring up what you call 3 limiting beliefs, which stop people from driving change. And they stop people from driving change in themselves, others, and systems. And those 3 limiting beliefs become that people are too selfish, dumb, evolved, flawed, and there's nothing anyone can do to change human nature, so trying to help the world is pointless. The second one is that government, corporations, the wealthy, political parties are too strong. There's nothing anyone can do to change them. And if there's going to be change, then it has to come from those groups. Individual efforts are irrelevant. And then there's a third, that technology, God, evolving consciousness, the planet systems, the government, free market, the perfect oneness of the universe will save us, and those powers of good will take care of us. And so our individual efforts are irrelevant anyway. And so you have to then internalize these things and say, I'm going to do one thing right now to start this train moving forward. And so I'm wondering if in the context of these barriers to action, you can talk about those very first steps that you took.
Yeah. So first of all, we talked about how I came to do the No Impact Man project. And there's a way in which you can talk about it as just somebody who's coming to live as environmentally as possible. But there's also a way in which you can talk about it as a human being who actually came to understand, who came to have a sense of purpose and mission and vision, as you talked about, and actually stepped off and started doing that, right? And I think because of the nature of what we're talking about, leadership, and what I think of as actually the heart of leadership, which is self-leadership, right? Actually being able to have the courage to envision and follow through in a person's convictions, right? I think it's really important just to know that there's this meta story going on here, which is about a person choosing to understand who they are and what they care about, and then moving forward into that, right? And when you talk about the limiting beliefs, so what happens is they start to have some idea that they could maybe do something to help the world. And one limiting belief is that they're too small. Then another limiting belief is that it's actually somebody else's responsibility. And then another limiting belief is that something else is actually going to fix it anyway. And those limiting beliefs they're kind of in our society. They're standard limiting beliefs. And what they do is they block us if we think to ourselves that we want to achieve some result. I want to save the world. Well, that's not possible. You're too small. It's somebody else's responsibility, and there's something already bigger than you that's going to fix it anyway, right? So ipso facto, me saving the world can't happen, right? But in my work with my clients and the work with myself that I've discovered is that it's not just about some big external result. It's about becoming yourself and following your nature, right? To actually let go of the question of whether or not you're going to achieve something big and let yourself just be. So there's the question that I always say to people is like, when people say, am I the type of person who can change the world? I always say, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to be the kind of person who tries? And the trying is part of what I call the Lifequester. That's part of what the Lifequester finds, something within themselves that they want to try in the world. Like I've done that a few times. I wanted to try to be a writer. I wanted to try No Impact Man. Just this business of, and the limiting stories, first of all, they're not true, of course. There are plenty of stories of individuals who have made gigantic change. And the story about how God or society or technology is going to fix the world is also not true, because all of those things require participation by individuals in them. Also, like, the stories are not true, but they're also moot. They don't matter if what you're trying to do is manifest the truth of yourself. And if what you're trying to do is just actually bring out your gifts into the world and offer them to the world, then that in itself, that's an end in itself. And I'll tell you this, Fran. So, as you know, No Impact Man, somehow it hit the public imagination. It was very controversial. There were, so much TV coverage and newspaper coverage and radio coverage. But when I launched the No Impact Man project, so when you're a nonfiction writer, you actually sell a book before you write it. You sell the idea to the publisher, and then you come up with the idea, you sell it to a publisher, they pay you to then turn the idea into a book. And so I had actually sold No Impact Man as a book before the No Impact year. And when I sold it for 3 times less money than my previous book, than Operation Jedburgh. And I say that because it was just so important to me to actually try bringing forth what was inside me. And I just assumed, Fran, it was going to be this tiny little book that didn't make much of a difference because the market had told me it was 3 times less popular than Operation Jedburgh. Of course, it turned around and was the opposite. But my point here is that all these limiting stories that we see outside of ourselves can be cut through if we actually do the work to trust ourselves.
I call these limiting beliefs a course of action of hopefully, right? Like hopefully someone's going to deal with it. Hopefully someone's going to intervene. Hopefully something's going to happen. And that is actually a concept. That's a word that in military planning is stricken from discussion. And I actually went to a school as a young officer where if you in your mission briefing said the word hopefully, it was an immediate fail. And people would say, and it's subconscious, right? They would say, okay, we're going to go do this. We're going to, one element's going to go to the left, one's going to go to the right. And then hopefully the enemy's going to do this. And it was an immediate stop. You fail, you're done. You cannot bank on someone else or something else intervening to make a change that is then going to make you move forward. And I think that concept applies in life. I think it applies in what you're doing. It applies in leadership, that if we are driven to change and we're creating a plan, a model, a method, a team, something that is going to take us from here to there to drive an organization, ourselves, teams, individuals forward, we have to understand that we can make an impact and our actions are going to make that impact. And if we sit back and say, well, if something else might happen where it's actually going to hopefully work, we're failing from the start.
Yeah. And the thing about it also, Fran, is first of all, your task can fail if you take that approach, like in the case of, when you're prosecuting a battle. But the other thing about it is that when you believe that something else is going to take care of it, hopefully, then you lose that which actually makes you human and your life purposeful and meaningful, which is agency. The sitting back and saying that it's going to be taken care of by something outside of ourselves means that we don't get actually to use who we are and to feel empowered. And that's a terrific loss.
So you brought up the success of the No Impact Project and No Impact Man. But this project gave you a voice. It gave you a podium. And I listened to a bunch of your interviews as I prepared for this conversation, and I read the books. And you really are very humble about how you approach that, where you're right. You didn't expect it to take off the way it did. But something that every writer, author, journalist seeks is to have that voice. For the point in time in which somebody looks at them and says, okay, tell me what you think. And then now all of a sudden you're the expert, right? We do, as leaders, we do it all the time, right? We wait till somebody comes in and says, okay, you're the boss now. Go stand up in front of the room and tell them what you think. And then you stand up in front of the room and you kind of look around and go, oh, I have no idea what I'm supposed to say right now. Or am I confident that what I'm about to say is actually real, that they're going to respect what I have to say? They're going to believe in it. You said in a few interviews that the biggest gift we can give is accepting the possibility of being wrong, and that to drive change, we must advocate for what we believe and trust that our experiences will give us the knowledge and ability to inform others. And so my question to you is, how does a leader more broadly embrace that pulpit when it comes without assuming arrogance or remaining grounded in the experiences that got them there? Because you contextualized it very well. You went from Operation Jedburgh and writing that very impactful story, that very personal story of something that changed the lives of these men and women who fought that war, to doing something that all of a sudden became very impactful across the world with a lot of eyes on it. How do you then sit and have those conversations without losing that sense of humility and the integrity behind what you did to get you to that point, where then somebody looks at you and says, they did it for show?
Yeah, I think the concept of leadership is really changing at the moment, Fran. And I think the old-fashioned concept of leadership conflated leadership and status, right? So as you described it, you can't wait to be in the front of the room. You can't wait to be the one whose ideas people listen to. You can't wait to be the one who decides. In some ways, I would say that's not actually leadership. That's just having status. That's just being the top king of the mountain sort of thing. Because real leadership, especially these days, especially as times change, as people change, as the concerns of our society changes, real leadership is based in listening, in my view. Right? So sure, we have personal experience and we have expertise and we have things that we bring, but the real expertise of a leader is to listen to the concerns of their various stakeholders and then to balance those concerns in a way that move the interests of all stakeholders forward together, right? So when you say, how does one stay humble while leading? I would say, how does one lead if they're not humble? Right? That actually these days, and I think that this is a challenge specifically for a certain set of our society, for certain sets of old-fashioned leaders, sometimes white men like myself who have had leadership modeled in a whole different way in the past, right? That actually we're having to adopt a whole, if we want to still be relevant in society, that we really have to learn to listen and not force our own energies upon the communities that we seek to serve, but to help those communities channel their own energies, whether that's in a society or an organization. So it's really interesting. Like, how do you, and I'm going to say that that you say, how do you stay humble once you're at the forefront? It's really a question of if you do want to be at the forefront, and forefront is the wrong word for a leader these days, I think, you have to be humble. Humble means to be grounded, right? Humble has the same root as the word humus or ground. And you have to be grounded in what's actually happening and what people care about and what they need and what your stakeholders need. And for that requires the humility to really hear. And one thing that I want to say about to blow my own horn a little bit, right? When I did No Impact Man, I ran a blog, which meant that I had the privilege of being in constant conversation with my readers. And I received, not to mention the mainstream press, I received every kind of criticism you could possibly imagine. And the weird thing is, and this goes to your question, like, how do you self-manage when you get, to some people, I was like a guru. Like, I remember I was in France, the French version of No Impact Man was launching, and this journalist asked me through an interpreter, he said, well, what is the meaning of life? I was like, are you serious? Like, you're asking
I don't know.
the meaning of life? I joked with him, and he said, I understood a little bit of my French is awful, but it's something like, vous êtes a guru, no? You're a guru, no? Aren't you a guru? Mm-hmm. So some people thought I was a guru, and some people then thought I was the devil. Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report called me an eco-manson, trying to serially murder our consumerist society, right? So these two sides. But what happened through all of that was that I listened to the criticism. I listened to the praise, and I listened to the criticism, and I synthesized it. I don't mean to say that I swallowed it whole without digesting it for myself, but I actually paid attention. So a big thing at that time in the environmental movement was the question of whether environmentalism was just the domain of the privileged. Like, it was okay for white middle class people, but what about poor people of color who can't afford to live environmentally and who are also disproportionately the victims of environmental catastrophe? And so that was a new idea to me at the time. I had to synthesize that and realize that environmentalism and social justice couldn't be separate. They had to come together. And then I had to write about that. And I had to admit, when I was wrong. And that's also where comes this idea that sometimes the most generous act we can do is to accept the possibility of being publicly wrong, right? To really be a leader, it means to listen. It means to accept when you're wrong. And if you do listen, if your ears are open, it's pretty hard to be arrogant. Getting a lot of shit.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think of the term servant leadership. When you speak about these concepts, that's the term that kind of comes to the back of my mind, this servant leadership, which was introduced in 1970, I believe, in the early 70s by a gentleman named Robert Greenleaf. And servant leadership focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people in the communities to which they belong, whereas traditional leadership involves this power or accumulation of this power that it looks like a pyramid. And so you called it status. And so there's a difference between these two because the servant leader has to share power. They have to put the needs of others first. They have to help people develop and perform at their highest capacity. You talked about empowerment a few moments ago. And so there's principles that live in this theory of servant leadership, principles like listening, empathy, healing, self-awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to people, community building. And the primary driver of change in servant leadership, I believe, is leading from the front. It's something that we in the military always spoke about and use it a lot in terms of speaking about the Jedburghs and speaking about the guests who come on the show, is this need to lead from the front. We have the Ranger organization in the military. Their phrase, Rangers lead the way. In the infantry, it's follow me. And that's their tagline. In special forces, Deo preso liber, free the oppressed. Well, in order to free the oppressed, we are the ones who are going to go do that. And we're going to build a foreign indigenous force to come behind us and alongside us and eventually put them forward to empower them to go be that freer of the oppressed. But it really is the show me how versus the tell me how style of leadership. Do as I do, not as I say. You've called that engaged citizenship. And there's a quote that you have, and I want to read it because I think this ties very well into what we're discussing. And it's, quote, "We know we have to change the system, but we must also remember that the system is only a collection of individuals. What the system does is just the aggregation of all of our individual actions as citizens, as shareholders, as CEOs, as product designers, as customers, as friends, as family members, and as voters. We have to stop waiting for the system to change and remember that every decision we make in our homes and in our workplaces accounts to the system." And so you speak with business leaders, you consult with individuals, teams, organizations, and you build these organizations to be stronger, more resilient, to find their meaning and then spread that meaning through this engaged citizenship model that can be in society, it can be in an organization, it can be in a team. And so I'm just interested in knowing, as you had to be that first person or the only person really through No Impact Man to then say, I'm going to go drive this change and I'm going to build this community around me. And I'm going to show you what engaged citizenship is. What have you learned from that? And then how do we commit to it? And how do we get others to commit to it? And I know that was probably, I threw a lot out there. I tend to do that.
You know what? There's a way in which you don't have to get others to commit to it. Let me explain what that means. So we talked a minute ago about the two different types of leadership, the traditional leadership model, which is status and power based, and the servant leadership model, which you talked about, right? And you could imagine that what you really need to do is get to change an organization. You have to get the traditional leader to commit to servant leadership, right? But there's also another approach, which is to just get people to commit to the inquiry, to human inquiry. Now, this type of inquiry is an inquiry that's at the foundation of spiritual practice. It's at the foundation of existential therapy. It's not something that needs to be given to us because we're born with it. It's this question, what am I? What am I? So many of us, we were brought up to say that we will be safe when we can control our circumstances and our environment. And in some ways, the kind of old fashioned, anyone, I could be president or I could be CEO. In some ways, that lust for that kind of power and that kind of status is about being in control or making oneself safe, right? In some ways, making oneself safe from pain, whether it be physical pain or emotional pain. If we can engage in this question, what am I? If we can truly come to know ourselves, if we can truly feel who we are and feel our pains and therefore not need to protect ourselves, if we can come to terms with our own humanity by becoming familiar with it and no longer have to put it at bay, then we are automatically listening, right? We automatically can hear. We automatically want to serve because we're not driven by this need to protect ourselves all the time, to protect our environments all the time. So if you like how we get people to actually commit to this idea of engaged citizenship, to this understanding that I'm not going to be able to quote him directly, but I'll paraphrase a Martin Luther King quote where he says, it's an inalienable fact that we are so connected that I cannot be everything I can be until you are everything you can be, right? And if we really examine our natures, if we really ask ourselves and come not to be trying to push our emotional lives away from us by controlling our environment, if we actually come to know who we are as human beings, then truths like that become apparent and we don't have to force a commitment upon ourselves. It's just the natural course of everyday life. Do you see what I mean? It's a nuanced difference in approach to what you asked me.
Absolutely. And I think there's another aspect of this too. When you're asking leaders, like you said, change, right? You're asking somebody to go from this pyramid status leadership to engaged leadership. There's probably a fear that comes from leaders where they think, well, what happens if I do that? Will I be weak? Will I lose? Will people not believe in me anymore? And the reality is it's not a single jump, right? Making change, whether we make change in ourselves, we make change in organizations, it happens incrementally over time. I call it, when I work with companies and even people, I call it turning an aircraft carrier. That if you think about an aircraft carrier is massive, it turns very slowly. And if you're sitting in the bridge or on the deck of an aircraft carrier and you're guiding this organization and you look at the compass, you're going to watch every degree of that compass as the bow of that organization comes around. But then one moment, you're going to look up and you're going to be going in a different direction. And that is how you change organizations. That's how you change people. It's this incremental approach. And when you became No Impact Man, when you started No Impact Project, you didn't just start on day one and say, well, that's it. Today, We have no electricity, no waste, no transportation, no processed foods. That's it. But we as people, and I think leaders, and especially I talk a lot about type A personality leaders, like myself, you live in the extremes. You live on this dial of, 1 or 10, and there's really very little middle ground. But there really is a middle ground, and this incremental process takes time, and you have to accept that it's going to take a long time to get to where you want to go. And so then we take a step back and we say, well, it's in the too hard box. I'm just not going to do it. I can't make these big changes. If you break it down into these small bits, then you can actually get there. You talked about this in No Impact Man. You said that was the hardest part, was actually the habit change, was getting yourself out of that rut, fighting that desire to jump back in because it was easy. And you spoke about some timelines that, habits take a month, was what the timeline that you put on there. It takes a month to break, certain habits. It's not an easy road to make these changes. And so, we talked a bit about it, but I'm just wondering if you can talk about some of the difficulty you faced. And sure, some of these things were very small and very tangible: no electricity, no processed foods, no waste. But at a macro scale, they drove massive change. And so how do you look at those things, commit to it, and say, I'm going to do this. It's going to be painful, but I'm still going to make it happen. And then what happens when you fail, right? When you fail, and you call it, I think you call it cheat a little in the book, but that's going to happen. And how do you get back up on it and start again?
So I'm going to answer your question. And before I do, I just want to address myself to something you said, which you talked about how leaders are scared to change. They're at the top of the pyramid. And you talked about, well, don't worry, change is incremental. So it's not like everything's going to change all at once, like an aircraft carrier. Yeah, and that's true. But also, I was on a call the other day with a friend of mine named Jennifer Brown, who does diversity and inclusion consulting for corporations. And somebody was asking, like, well, if you're a leader of an organization and now suddenly you're supposed to be talking about race and race equity and stuff like that, that's really scary. Like, how are you supposed to start that conversation? And Jennifer said, it's going to be scarier for your organization if you don't start the conversation. So it's the same thing. Like when the leaders are saying, like, I'm scared to move away from this pyramid structure, chances are it's going to be scarier if you don't. So in the book after No Impact Man, How to Be Alive, I tell a story called the Ukulele Approach. This is to your question about incremental change and how do you get started. We have this kind of all or nothing, like you said, 0 or 10. We have this all or nothing thing. Like either I'm already there, or I'm no impact man. Like I make no impact, or I'm nowhere, right? So in How to Be Alive, I tell a story about this guy called Jonathan. And he, all his life, wishes he played guitar. But then he listens to Eric Clapton and he thinks, what's the point of me playing guitar, right? There's Eric Clapton. I'm never going to be like Eric Clapton. And playing guitar is hard, right? So one day he's in the park and he sees some people chilling around the park playing the ukulele. And his friend plays the ukulele, and there's only 4 strings on the ukulele. And he wants to be a musician, but finally he's like, chances are I'm never going to be a great guitar player. I'll try this little ukulele, right? He just tries it. And then he learns to play the ukulele. And then from there, he's learned enough to take the step to the guitar, right? And then from there, he's made the step to actually where he ends up in a band. They call that the ukulele approach, just like starting with what you can, like what you're talking about, incremental change. But something else that I want to talk about that I think is really important for leaders, a big thing in an organization that can be hard when you're starting to make change is that to make change, the first thing you have to do is measure where you are, right? And for many leaders, what's scary is that if they measure where they are on some of the new cultural indicators, right? If they measure where they are, then they're going to be like, God, we really suck.
Yeah, you don't want to even accept it. You start looking for all the reasons why the data is wrong.
That's right. Not to change the data, right? So an approach that some leaders take is to be completely transparent about the process, where they start by being like, I'm an old-fashioned leader. This is an old-fashioned organization, but we realize we've had to change. So we're going to start by measuring where we are. And we're kind of scared about what it's going to look like, right? And then they get the data and they say, we got the data. We were right to be scared. But guess what? We have some goal. My point is that another way forward in terms of because a lot of times what's scary is the optics. The change is the optics because it's a messy process. So learning to be a new style of communication as an organization or as a person, where on an individual level, we're just talking about what Brené Brown talks about, which is vulnerability, which is just saying like, yeah, I'm not very good at this, but I'm going to try. It's a combination of the iterative approach, like allowing yourself to move forward step by step, and also learning to be able to communicate and be transparent about your process, because people can be more forgiving than you think if you're really sincere about making change.
Yeah, I agree. We interviewed a bit ago a journalist and author by the name of Cleo Stiller. Cleo wrote a book called Modern Manhood about how to be what she termed a good man in the Me Too environment. And the context of that conversation is very much about what you discuss here, which is being comfortable having uncomfortable conversations was one part of it. And then the second part was about being introspective. And so you introduced both these topics here, and that's why I kind of want to dig in a little bit deeper, because the first step to having the uncomfortable conversation is the acceptance of we're not good enough. The introspection to say, I may have acted, the behavior that I may have displayed that got us to this point is not the behavior that we need to exhibit to move ourselves, our teams, our organizations forward. And so there's this acceptance that I wasn't good enough. I'm going to tell you that I'm not good enough. And from here, we can have difficult and uncomfortable conversations in the workplace, in our relationships with our significant others, with our friends and families, because we're accepting that we're all owning it wasn't good enough to be here. And so now how do we come together collectively, talk about it, have that transparency, and then build a community to be better in the future?
And I'm going to add in there too, Fran, while also not being fragile in the process. So there's a way, you've probably heard this term white fragility, but I'm going to talk about it not just in terms of being white, but being male or being an old-fashioned organization or something, which is somehow it's natural, but what we want when we decide to change and we make ourselves vulnerable is everybody to pat us on the back and be like, that's great, you're changing. And I think that there is an element where, it's true, it is good if you're trying to change, but we also can't insist that we are praised. We have to accept that something allowed us to get into the stage where we weren't as good as we could be already. And we have to be able to face up to the pain that's going to come when people do say things that are critical. And then to engage, I hear you is a really, that's a good answer. So there's a whole kind of complex, this is, we talked a little bit about new leadership, where leadership is, we used to think leadership was about blah, 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 talking, spouting, lecturing, bossing. Now leadership is about listening, right? And it's about listening, and it's about synthesizing. It's about hearing. It's about being able to accept criticism also.
I want to ask you about the philosophy of Zen. This is really fascinating to me because a lot of what you do, a lot of what you speak about, write about is grounded in this philosophy. You're a senior Dharma teacher in Zen. And I bring it up because I'm not familiar with it, so I cannot speak from any position of knowledge, which is actually why my curiosity behind this and speaking with you is a reason why I want to ask you a couple of questions. But I've had a few guests who've come on, they've spoken about meditation. I looked up the definition of Zen, which is actually meditation. That's the definition of the word is meditation. And I've recently gotten into yoga, and I think physically it's done a lot for me to improve injuries that I've had in the past and made me feel better. And then mentally, it's kind of been a nice way in this COVID era to step out and kind of put your body through these routines where you are looking inward, and it's very soothing. But it's a big part of what you talk about. And there is a story about a hot tub approach. And the reason why I want to speak about Zen in the context of the hot tub approach is because it is about trying. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that and how that story about the Pope and the hot tub really makes a person sit there and say, if we just try, we can get there.
So first of all, I'm going to answer your question about Zen. So Zen is, it means understanding yourself. Zen is understanding yourself. I've said this, you've heard this question, what am I? A few times before. And if you ask that question really sincerely, what am I? You come to a place of not knowing, right? Not knowing is a place before ideas and opinions. right? It's a place where your mind and my mind are the same, actually, before our ideas and opinions. There's a fundamental faith in Zen that if we actually allow ourselves to not know, if we can become comfortable with not knowing, then clear answers and ways forward that will arise that are both good for you and me, right? Without separation. So and ultimately Zen is a way of being that allows us to live in line with our true nature, right? It's not that when we ask this question, what am I, that we come up with an answer. It's that when we ask the question, what am I, and throw away our assumptions about what we are, then we naturally line up with truth. You and I then function together. You and I function together with the world when we put down our ideas and our opinions about what we are and what the world should be. But the story that you're referring to, so I come from a particular tradition of Zen Buddhism, which comes down from Korea. I'm a senior Dharma teacher, as you say, in what's called the Kwan School of Zen. And we have sanghas all around the country in Europe and Asia. But the founder of the Quantum School of Zen was a Korean Zen master who was a monk named Zen Master Seungsong. And he was a very charismatic guy. That's why our school is so big, because he just kept telling students, start a Zen center, start a Zen center. They did. And now we have so many Zen centers. But he got it into his head that the way to world peace, the problems in the world had to do with different religious understandings, that we were fighting over our different philosophies, and that if we wanted world peace, what was required was that we got the Pope. Well, first of all, is that we got the world's religious leaders together in one hot tub. That they just needed, if the world's religious leaders could just have a hot tub together, there would be peace.
Because the heat and the bubbles solve all the problems.
Totally. So I'm not saying, by the way, this is not a crazy idea, but Zen Master Song, he didn't ask himself a lot of times whether his ideas were crazy or not. That's why he got so much done. He just went for it. And so he decided that the way to get all the world's religious leaders in a hot tub together would be to get the Pope in the hot tub. If the Pope invited everybody to have a hot tub, they all would just do it. So he decided he had to get the Pope to launch this idea. And he flew to Rome, and he just walked up to the front gates of the Vatican and said that he wanted to see the Pope. And the guard eventually took him to talk to a priest. And he said to the priest he needed to see the Pope. And the priest eventually took him to a bishop. And then he told the bishop he needed to see the Pope. And the bishop eventually took him to see the cardinal. And the cardinal was like one step away from the Pope. And the cardinal was like, well, why do you want to see the bishop? And he explained his idea. And he was like, we just need to get all the world's religious leaders in a hot tub together. And the cardinal was like, yeah, you're not going to see the Pope. This story is it's a story about what we call try mind. Keep try mind. The saying goes, just try for 10,000 years nonstop, right? That means you're never actually asking about results. We talked about this before. You're just following your own true nature and trying. And people say, well, I don't like that. Sometimes people say, I don't like that story. That's not a good story. That's a story of failure. Like he tried and he failed. But he didn't fail, because however many, 1,000 or so people who download this podcast are going to hear this story about this crazy Zen master who just tried. He thought he could save the world, and he just tried. And this story has been told over and over again. And so many people have heard it and laughed at it, but been inspired. It's okay to be crazy if you're trying to help people. It's okay to try, right? So it's a story about two things. It's a story about, one, that just try, like just do it. And then it's also a story about the good side of the doctrine of unintended consequences, right? That sometimes when we try, when we put the energy in the world, we might not get our vision, right? But we still might fulfill our mission. That this story continues to be told has helped a lot of people just to be crazy and try to have crazy mind in a good way.
And it's not all that crazy, especially in terms, if you think about where we are today with going through COVID over the last year, and you think about this thought of, we just got to get everyone together. If we just get everyone together, they're going to have a conversation. And then you really think about the value of personal contact, and something we've all had to go through in the last, year plus now, of what have we not achieved, right? Because I think we speak a lot about COVID in terms of, well, we've achieved so much. Our company we've done so many things remotely. We've maintained our friendships, we've maintained our relationships, we maintained forward progress. But we forget about the opportunity cost that we really don't know if we can quantify, right? What are the things that we didn't get done because we weren't in the room together? And now, is that a metric that we actually want to look at? I don't know. It may fall into that box that you talked about, is when do we evaluate ourselves first? Do we really want to look at that data and say, okay, yeah, because we may very well look at that data and say, oh, man, we didn't do anything. We did some stuff, but we didn't achieve as much as we really needed to. So I actually really like that story for that context too, is that something comes from being in the room with others that is not replicatable in other venues.
Yeah. Just before we started talking, I was on with a client, and this client, they have a particular issue in their marriage. And I asked the client, have you talked to your partner about this? Have you talked to your spouse? And they said, no, I need to figure out what to do about it first. And I was like, I said, because of this particular client, I said, there are those words again, figure it out. And they laughed. My client laughed, because the conversation itself about the problem is generative, right? You don't have to have a solution before you come together in a room with people like you're talking about. Just coming together is in itself generative. Not even knowing 100%, not even having a clear definition of the problem is generative, right? So again, we're back to this question of vulnerability, which is not necessarily having it figured out, but just being willing to come together and be in conversation, be in the mix about it.
Which will drive it forward in one way, maybe positive, maybe negative, but it will start traction, and traction in those times is a good thing. So we got to close out, and we close every show by having a conversation about the Jedburghs, which I'm really excited to have with you because you understood these folks at such a foundational level through your research. But the Jedburghs, they had to do 3 things every day to be successful. And these 3 things were they had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, and they had to be able to communicate. If they did those 3 things well every day at a foundational level, it didn't matter what challenges came their way in other things. They could find a solution because that was the core of what they did. And so my question to you is, what are the 3 things that you do every day to be successful in your world upon which any other challenge can be tackled?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question because I'm not sure that these things make me successful or not successful, Fran, but I'm going to tell you some things that feel really important to me to do no matter what. I'll tell you this, like in my Zen tradition, sometimes people say, why do we practice? Why do we meditate? And one Zen master I know says, stop meditating and you'll know why. And that's true of me. Like if I don't sit in the morning, I don't mind admitting this. I think it's an important thing to admit that constitutionally, when I wake up in the morning, I wake up slightly anxious or slightly tense, slightly worried. And so I don't want to run my life in order to make that feeling of anxiety or worry go away. So the first thing that I do in the morning when I get up is I meditate. And usually sometime during the course of the meditation, that mild discomfort in my body alleviates. More importantly, it kind of sets me up for the day. It just makes me clear and ready to move on. The next thing that I do is I do this kind of combination of vision and prayer. So after meditation is complete, then I spend a little while envisioning what the world would be like if it was loving and kind and safe and equitable, and where people got to pursue what feels most important, where they get to actually grow and to their full potential, and that's available to everyone. So I actually hold that image in my head for a little while. And then I start to introduce and how can I be part of bringing that about? And then I also, because I'm not unselfish, I also introduce, and how will I personally be rewarded? Besides for the fact that I would get to live in that world, but I think about fiduciary rewards. And then I vision some other things about life as I would like it to be. And then I move on to my day and I ask for guidance and to whatever. And I say whatever with a capital W. I don't mean that as a disparaging whatever.
Right.
and I ask for guidance, and I ask to be reminded to ask for guidance later in the day too, when I get confused. So I do that. Okay, so those are 2 things, or 3 maybe. And then the 4th thing is I look for the next opportunity to talk to my daughter. When am I going to get to talk to Bella and have a really good conversation with my little girl? Because I love her more than life itself. Give anything just to have a good conversation with her.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So I look at all of these things that you've done in your career. I think about this discussion that we've had about leadership, impact, changing the world, the demonstration of the fact that one person, one man, one woman, someone who commits their mind to doing something and shows others that they can also do it, creates lasting change and impact. I tie it back to the 9 characteristics of elite performance in special operations that are as defined by special operations, which started with the Jedburgh organization. The 9 being drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, effective intelligence, team ability, curiosity, and emotional strength. And I think about you in this context. And elite performers, as you have, demonstrate all 9 of these at various times, depending on the situation that they're in. And I kind of like to put one on everybody that I speak with. And when I think about you, I think about curiosity. Exploring the unknown, questioning the status quo in pursuit of better, a continuous growth attitude. And that's something that you've committed to, this constant curiosity to drive organizations, teams, people, the world forward. In the Talent War Group, we say that we want everybody to be a disruptive leader. You've done that in so many different ways. John Quincy Adams, he said, if your actions inspire people to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. And I think you demonstrate that every day because you're making us think about things that we can do and have the confidence to do to then change us, those around us, and society by sticking to it. There's a quote you have that I want to end on, and it's that quote, "The most amazing news is that when you become yourself, you respond with the utmost appropriateness to the world around you. You stop fighting what is inside of you and start trusting your real needs and ways of doing things." Unquote. Colin, transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, those dedicated to winning, they never stop trying. They no-fail missions to it, and they have to achieve their vision. They understand their mission. They drive forward. They define the Jedburgh lineage that you wrote about and you understand better than all of us, and they're changing the world. You're changing the world by empowering us. I thank you so much for joining me here today, and I really, truly do look forward to our next conversation.
No, thanks, Fran. Me too. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.